You may not know what an elder law attorney is, so maybe it'd be a good idea to start with that. When I went to law school 35 years ago, I started very young, they did not have elder law attorneys. There were no classes in elder law. There was estate planning and estate administration, and it was pretty much assumed that you wrote wills and powers of attorney and that kind of thing, and that planning consisted of planning for retirement, and then you would live for a short time after retirement, and then you were gone. So you didn't need to have long-term care planning for seniors who were going to live to be 85, 90, 95, and I just met with clients this morning where the lady's mother is 102, and she's caring for her at home. And she's been caring for her for the last 10 years, and when she went to her sister and said, "I'd like to take a vacation," her sister said, "You knew what you were getting into when you took Mom, and I'm not going to watch Mom during your vacation." So the demands on, it's not a family I would want to belong to, but the demands on family caregivers are extreme today. And so the elder law practice is really something that is new, which is kind of ironic to have elder law being new, but I belong to the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys. That has been around for about maybe 20 years or so. And also the Pennsylvania Association of Elder Law Attorneys, which lobbies so that they will stop passing such bad legislation. And we're working our best to prevent bad legislation and to advance good legislation. It's helpful to caregivers. And the practice of elder law takes estate planning to another level, which says after a person retires and before a person dies, there's a really good chance that at some point they're going to need some help. They're going to be disabled, they may have chronic illnesses, and they're going to need their family or other caregivers to come in to give them help. And that's what elder law is all about. And I'm chair of the elder law section of the Chester County Bar Association also. So, the burden on the family caregiver has been something that has grown over the years, and it has really not been recognized the way I believe it should be in terms of benefits, in terms of compensation, and how do you plan. That lady who had Mom living with her for 10 years, she never expected that at 92 her mother was going to be, and in fact when she started it was Mom and Dad, and then Dad passed away and she continued on with Mom. She never expected that at 102 she would still be taking care of her mother. So a couple things have happened. One of them is that some of the insurance companies that place long-term care insurance have come up with some studies. And they, of course, have an interest because they would like people to take out insurance to cover at least a portion of the cost of care. And one of the earlier studies was called the MetLife Juggling Act study. And the MetLife Juggling Act study actually goes back to the 1990s, and it surveyed some employed persons who were also caregivers. And they came up with some not just interesting statistics, but also some statements. My boss had big plans for me, but the district manager position became impossible due to my mother's needs. My company has out-of-state conferences and seminars on new technology I was not able to attend. I was not able to do the travel or take the job in another city because it would be disruptive to my mother's health. I went back to work. I needed the money for my mother's care. I was using my savings to take care of her. Then she had a stroke. I'm not giving good news here, I understand that, okay? But I stayed there at the hospital with her. There was no way for me to be at the hospital and work at the same time, and then I went on a leave of absence and so on. So there were many personal situations that came to light as a result of these studies. And the studies have continued, and AARP has a few that are available actually on their website, and if you would want to get some additional information on some of these, you can contact our office, and we can get you some of the background on these studies. But the most recent one that I saw was in 2011. It was from AARP Public Policy Institute. It was called Valuing the Invaluable. So I want you to understand you're invaluable. In other words, you're priceless. Okay? 2011 update the economic value of family caregiving in 2009. And this takes a somewhat different focus. This says, look at the benefit to society that is being offered by caregivers, by family caregivers, who are offering help in their homes. And let's take a look at what things should be done to help them. What they estimated as of, they had their numbers up to 2009, they said family caregivers provided care valued at $450 billion in 2009. We know that it's up since then, but $450 billion. And they said, to give you an idea of what $450 billion means, they said it's more than the total Medicaid spending in the year that they made the determination, including both the federal spending and the state spending for health care and long-term care. So more than all of that. Nearly 4 times the Medicaid long-term care nursing home spent in 2009. As much, now they go into the private sector, as much as the total sales of the world's largest companies, including Walmart, and the 3 largest publicly held auto companies. Well, maybe the automobile industry isn't a good comparison today, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But as much as the total sales of the world's largest companies, including Walmart, that's how much family caregiving is worth. Almost $1,500 for every person in the United States. So it would be, if every family caregiver got up and said, I'm on strike, I'm not working anymore, and you had to replace it with taxpayer dollars, it would be at least, and I think more, but it would be at least another $1,500 in tax dollars to the American public for every person, not for every adult, for every person, so including men, women, children. So, and Pennsylvania is especially affected because we have, according to some of the studies that have been conducted, we have the 2nd highest elderly population percentage-wise, right after Florida, of any other state in the country. So, so we're up there in age. We got a lot of old people in Pennsylvania, so we have a lot of caregivers. And they estimated in 2009, so that's 2 years back, the total number of hours of care for home caregivers, family caregivers in Pennsylvania at 1,770,000,000 hours. Okay, so now there, in terms of support, well, I mean, as you probably realize, if you're willing to give support for free, there aren't too many people out there who are going to say, gee, we really want to pay you for it. Okay? It doesn't happen too often, once in a while maybe. One of the questions is, what kind of backup, what kind of support is out there? There's not too much. There is a family caregivers support program that is a federal program, and the state also has a family caregiver law. But if you've applied for it, typically you're talking about something like $200 a month, which by the time you get done the paperwork, some people would rather just waive the $200 and go on their own. It also may give some supports in terms of if you're building, say, handicap ramps and things like that. Okay, but it's not a great deal of help. There have been laws proposed to increase that and also to extend payment for caregivers beyond the family so that you could hire somebody else and you could go to work or take a break or whatever. And actually, just as of yesterday, there was a bill reported by, it was Representative Matt Baker, introduced a bill to update Pennsylvania's family support law to include non-relative caregivers and bring the state program in line with the federal program. The federal law doesn't mesh with the state law in every respect, so so even some of the dollars that we could otherwise get, we don't necessarily get because the laws aren't in sync with each other. You may have also seen, and I wrote a column on this, that recently Pennsylvania has been taking people off of Medicaid. And in fact, the front page of the Daily Local today has an article about that. Medicaid is the program pretty much of last resort. That's the program where when a person runs out of money, they're in a nursing home, then they could qualify for Medicaid. And also, if you're talking about at home, if you have a parent who is on, and I'm looking at all you young ladies here, so I'm assuming we're talking about parents. If you have a parent in a nursing home who has very low income, like if they had, actually I think at this point they're up to almost to $2,000 in income they're allowed to have and qualify for what's called the Medicaid waiver program at home. But the state has recently been sending out notices to people who are on Medicaid, not all of them, but a number of them. I've had some clients come in on this, and has said, answer this questionnaire, and if you don't answer in 10 days, we're taking you off Medicaid. And by using that mechanism, it's been reported back that 190,000 people have been taken off of Medicaid since the new administration came in. So 190,000 people is a lot of people. I haven't seen much of it with nursing home residents, but and I think that it's being sent mostly to people who are in the community on Medicaid. Medicaid is not just for elderly, okay? But it is something to watch out for if you run into that situation. You get a questionnaire from the government to be sure to answer it, to respond. Okay. Now, the question, are caregivers compensated? Can caregivers be compensated? In addition to that, say $200 on the caregiver support law. And that's on a sliding scale depending on how much you have in assets and so on. So it's not a lot. Can you be compensated? And I think that's a very important issue. And as an attorney, I'll tell you one of the reasons why. Very often, parents write their wills in such a way that it says, I have 3 children, I want my estate divided evenly among the 3 children. And that's a very admirable, way of splitting things. And a lot of people are worried about whether their children will love them after they die, and so they don't want to have any hard feelings. I said, well, you're not going to be around anyway, so you don't really need to worry. But in any event, they feel that it's fair to divide it evenly among their 3 children. But if one of their children is bearing the burden of caring for them, has maybe taken them into their home and is paying expenses for them, and the other 2 children are, say, one is in Hawaii and the other one is in New York, and they send a Mother's Day card once a year and maybe visit at Christmas time, somehow the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 doesn't always come out to be fair, in my opinion. It's not even. And one way to handle that is something that we do, that my office does in our practice, and it's called a family agreement. And family agreements are addressed really at the end of this, but I wanted to make sure that we would get to it. But a family agreement can be made with a parent where the parent would basically, I call it you hire your kids. And you pay your kids for the work that they're doing as they're doing it. So that if your children are taking you into their home, and you have utility bills, you have mortgage, you have food bills, groceries, and you're taking your parent to the doctors and providing other assistance. That a family agreement is a way that you can get paid. But as far as the government is concerned, in order to do that, you need to have that in a written agreement with your parent. Otherwise, what happens is, people come into my office and they say, I've taken care of my mother or my father for the last 20 years, and I never took anything. In fact, I paid a lot of their expenses, and can I recover any of that before my parent goes on Medicaid? And next thing, it's, you're paying first a nursing home if that's what they need, and then, the government picks up, but the person is out of money. And unfortunately, we can't backdate it. And this is a very important concept. You need to know that if you want to work out an arrangement with your parent, that it needs to be done in advance so that then they can pay you. It's pay as you go kind of thing. And I know that it's not the way we have handled family relationships, not even family business transactions in this country historically. But I've used the joke at elder law conferences. I say, my daughter is 14 now. The day that she turns 18, she's going to get a stack of documents like this, starting with a HIPAA release, so that I can get all of her medical records, and going into, I'm not at the point that she'll take care of me for the rest of my life in exchange for my putting her through college, but, maybe we'll think about that. But in any event, we have reached the point, really, in this country that if you want to be reimbursed for what you're doing and have a fair treatment, what you need to do is think up front of having an agreement with your parent, and then if your parent is failing in particular, you want to do it, if possible, before their condition worsens, and get it all down there so that the person who is doing the lion's share of the work and paying most expenses gets compensated. I'm just going to really quickly deal with a couple of the other issues, and then we're going to move into Jeff's portion of the presentation. I won't ask you, but you can, kind of quietly raise your hand under the table or whatever, as to how many of you have health care powers of attorney for your parents or the person you're caring for. Oh, okay. So you actually, raised it above the table. So that's okay. Okay, so you have health care powers of attorney. That's very important because if you want to demonstrate to a medical professional that you have the right to act on behalf of your parent, they may require that. They might not even release results of medical tests and that kind of thing to you unless you have a health care power of attorney. And it should include the HIPAA release. The other part of it is a financial power of attorney. Okay, I'll ask you to raise your hand on that. Financial power of attorney? Okay, so I'm talking to the more savvy group here. There are a lot of people out there who wouldn't even know what I'm talking about. But a financial power of attorney is critically important if your parent or the person you're caring for is unable to handle financial transactions, unable to pay the bills. You really should also take a look at the language. Not every financial power of attorney is the same. Some of them, if they were drafted some years back, might not necessarily comply with the law the way it is today. Also, it needs to be specific as to what can be done as far as gifting. It's a good idea to have it cover what we talked about with compensation, so that you are paid for services, or family members are paid for services. Could be your children, or so the grandchildren are sometimes involved, and that kind of thing. There also should be specific language regarding IRAs, 401ks, life insurance, because there have been court cases involving those assets, and it's important that the power of attorney designate what can be done with it, what can't be done with it. So I keep adding things to powers of attorney. I will read powers of attorney that clients of mine have and say, wow, that's a really neat provision, I like that, I think I'll add that to mine, and start, and so the powers of attorney begin to become a little bit longer. And on the other hand, there are some things in some of them that are kind of, some of the old ones talk about flower bonds and all kinds of things that, what's a flower bond? Who knows? But some of the old ones are kind of quaint. You can't file legal-size paper in a courthouse anymore. If your power of attorney is so old it's on legal-size paper, they won't take legal-size paper. And they require...
It's illegal?
Huh?
It's illegal?
It's illegal to have legal-size paper, right? And in fact, if you file an attachment to an inheritance tax return, and it is 8.5 by 14 paper, they will not even clock it in for you. So if you have, and I tell people, be sure to rewrite your will if you have, and I wrote a column about this, it was sort of humorous some time back, if you have named your former husband as the, beneficiary of your will, you want to make sure that's out of there. If you have named a trustee for your child and your child is 45 years old, you can do away with the trustee. If your uncle who was going to administer your estate has since passed away, if you now have grandchildren and your grandchildren are not addressed in the will, and when I say you, I'm taking it in the very broadest sense and to include parents, take a look at their documents. I had a document that came in a couple weeks ago where, and people will do almost anything to try to save money, and sometimes it costs a great deal of money to save money. The example that I have is that the original will was done by an attorney. And I think that mom figured, well, she didn't want to go back to an attorney and spend a bunch of money to change her will. So what she said was, instead of the statement in my original will that I want everything to go to my daughter Mary, I would like her to share equally, I would like my daughter Sue and my niece Josephine to share equally with my daughter Mary. Okay? Now, does that mean she wants each of them to get 1/3? Or does she want 2 of them to get a half and the other one to get a half? And she's gone, so we don't know. And that could end up being a will contest, and that's not what we want, so we're going to have to try to work something out. But people really need to be careful about their legal documents. It's not, people will say, well, it's so easy. It's not as easy as you think. At this point, what I'd like to do is hand it over to Jeff, and then he's going to... Jeff and I, just as very quick background, my brother and I went into business together because of my mother's illness. My mother had dementia, and we were power of attorney for my mother. And we spent so much time together, we started a business together. And we've been at our current location for 10 years, but we've been involved working out ideas on this for the last 15. And the reason that we went into business together was because we said there is no one place that people can go to with answers for all of their problems. And what we do is we handle the legal, the financial, and the care. And we have a care coordinator on staff who goes to nursing homes and assisted livings and makes sure that people receive the kind of care they should get. And we do with hospitals and insurance companies and all those things. And when people come in, what we prefer to do is to put together a plan that covers everything. So you have a framework to work from. Jeff's a certified senior advisor. He can explain what that means. And I'm going to pass over to him.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, I'm Jeff Jones, Life Transition Services. As Janet said, I'm a certified senior advisor. What that is a group of professionals who work with seniors, caregivers, and their families. It's a multidisciplinary group, and we cover, we have people who are visiting nurses, some financial planners, insurance agents, healthcare workers, and also paralegals as well. So Transition Services, as Janet said, we joined with her legal background because people, even when they're aware of what their legal rights are and they have the legal documents, when they're entitled to government benefits to pay for the cost of care, either at home or in an assisted living or in a skilled nursing residence, they still have to go through a mountain of paperwork in order to get it. And unfortunately, that's very common. And trying to jump through all the hurdles in order to get the benefits that you're entitled to can be difficult, and that's what we aim to help with. So just as an overview, I want to describe what are typical situations, because a lot of times families say, oh, well, what I go through is typical. You must hear this all the time. And I'm tempted to say, to tell you the truth, you're unique. You're the first situation I've had in this condition. What we like to say is that every family has a fingerprint. Everyone has fingerprints, but they're all different. And that's what our experience with families are. They have similar situations, but each family has a unique situation, and that's what we try to address. We wanted to just briefly discuss what the assets income are typically. What are the long-term care parameters that government looks at in order to assess what level of care a person needs. I also want to discuss what the cost of care is, because sometimes people are very surprised how costly it can get, especially quite frankly, in Chester County. This is among the highest cost area in the whole state. I want to describe briefly, too, the spend down. That's very unique in terms of the finances. Usually, people throughout their life are trying to either build up their assets or maintain where they're at. Well, oftentimes in a long-term care situation, there is no choice. Your assets, or I should say, your parents' assets, are going to be spent down. And the government expects this, knows this, and that's part of what, in a way, the system tries to address for families. And then finally, we just want to touch on some common pitfalls that families come up against, and also some solutions. One of the interesting things to me, because when I go home at night, it's interesting. I work with families with long-term care issues during the day, but at night when I go home, I'm very interested in what is the retirement situation like these days. And this is from the Employee Benefits Research Institute. And each year they have what they call a retirement confidence survey. And it kind of gives you an idea of, well, gee, how much did you save for retirement? And, how is that distributed? And if you look, there's roughly a third of the people have less than $10,000, even though they're older than 55 years old. There's unfortunately a sizable number of people who even basically have saved nothing over the years. And it could be either that they just haven't saved from the beginning, or they depleted it over time because of emergency situations, or because of the stock market, that went down, that's it, it got depleted. What's of particular note to me, I kind of like to look at the midway point here, because it's about 50-50, 50% above and 50% below when you get around that $50,000 level. So if somebody were to say, well, what typically do people save by the time they're in that retirement, area? Generally, $50,000 is kind of an interesting benchmark. If somebody's above that, that's great. If somebody's below that, well, that's more typical than you may believe. There's one other footnote to this, though, too. Even if we look at the people who have saved above $250,000, Trinity University did a study, I believe it was about 10 years ago, and there's always a debate, how much money should I take out of my retirement? Before they did the study, typically people took 7% a year of their assets out of the retirement to pay for their cost of living, over the years. Well, they did what's called a Monte Carlo simulation over a 30-year period, and they actually came out, you should be taking 4% out. So now if you are among the 20% or so, the upper 20%, who even have $250,000, that's 4% of that a year is $10,000 a year. And that the idea is that would be to last you 30 years, which would be what their estimate of a typical retirement would be. So I just wanted to give you some numbers that way. This is another. This is household income. Okay, this is in terms of a distribution. This kind of surprised me. They're saying the typical the typical single person or the typical one-person income in this country is $25,000 a year. And for the household income, which is right here, the median household income is $50,000 a year. And I don't want you to remember a lot of numbers, but those were two very interesting numbers to me to at least give some kind of key as to where the assets are in this country, and also what the income level is in this country. Because what we're going to do in the next few slides is talk about how does that compare to the cost of care, and why families get into the situations that they do. Now, one of the key things about the cost of care is, let's go back to what does care mean. One of the key things they look at is what they call activities of daily living. That's how they gauge, well, what skill level does a person need to have addressed. And in the activities of daily living, among them are eating, bathing, dressing, toileting, transfer or moving from one location to another, incontinence. Okay? And when people have trouble with these, as they need assistance more and more with that, the government considers, well, you need more level of care that way. Now, the cost of care, I'm looking at really two components. It's interesting because I think a lot of people on their own, maybe a little bit, they'd have to do a little bit of thinking to say, well, how much does it cost to live at home? Well, the government doesn't have that problem. They know how much it costs to live at home. It costs $1,839 a month. That's what they say it costs to live at home. The reason I say that is because if you have a situation where one spouse is in a long-term care residence and another spouse is at home, what they guarantee the spouse at home gets is that $1,839 a month. That's it. So they don't look at things like owning a car insurance. They do make an allowance for homeowners insurance, but this is what they call the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. And the reason I'm bringing this up...
By the way, that's in connection with Medicaid.
Right. This is for when when we get further down, I'll describe how this plays in particular. But what's interesting is they have a vernacular. They have an actual vocabulary and associated with the cost of care. Now, Janet has been an elder law attorney for 15 years. I've been a certified senior advisor with Life Transition Services for 10 years. I have yet to meet, actually, and nothing against the profession, I have yet to meet one financial professional who knows about even this one term, the minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance. And see, the key thing is that when you have the vocabulary is not known, it becomes very difficult to help families with that.
This is hitting closer to home. I mean, really, we could all be in this boat ourselves.
Absolutely.
30 plus years. Do you advise that we should have separate assets? Because I did go through this with my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and we did have to spend down. So she had like CDs, or I forget. She had things in her own name, so they couldn't touch that, right? I mean, they only could touch what was joint or what was in my father-in-law's name, just to spend down for Medicare.
Well, I mean, are you talking about commingling assets?
No, what happened was he was going to a nursing home, so then,
Okay.
Can
Sure,
I?
go ahead.
Okay. There are very specific legal rules as to what can be done and what can't be done, which actually could take up probably the rest of the afternoon at least. But there are protections for spouses, and there are things that can be done for adult children. The most important thing that we tell people is that when you run out of money, if you come in, we can't make money in the basement. I mean, we don't have the printing press going downstairs. So what we tell people is, if you feel that you're going to be affected by a healthcare long-term problem, a chronic illness, come to us first before money is gone, because then there are things that we can do. And it's not necessarily transfer everything out of your name. There are other things that you should look at, because there are rules regarding what kind of asset and when it can be done and that kind of thing that are very specific. But you can't run out of money, and when you have $10,000, you can't say, now I want a plan.
right, okay, thank you.
So, in terms of how the government has very specific rules that way, but we kind of have the government way, but we have life. We have the way we run our lives, too. And I just wanted to bring that distinction. Now, at this point here, this typically is what we concern with the room and board, medical, pharmaceutical, and ancillary. Those are all of the costs associated with long-term care. And actually, if there's good news here, it's what government benefits covers. When somebody qualifies, for example, for medical assistance, and they're in a long-term care residence, the government covers all this. In fact, the only thing they don't cover are things like telephone, cable TV, haircuts, things like that. So there is a safety net out there. You know, there definitely is good news. It's just understanding how things work and getting to that point, you know, if it becomes necessary. Going back to this idea about activities of daily living, if somebody decides they want to live in an assisted living, that typically means they don't need any help in terms of the general activities they do. And of course, the cost goes, that should really be $1,000 plus. I mean, it depends on what level of accoutrements that you have. But with assisted living, we are seeing, particularly in Chester County, it can be $5,000 a month. That's what we assume unless somebody tells us otherwise. And for skilled nursing, when somebody needs help with 3 to 4 or more activities of daily living, $9,000 a month. Some families are coming $10,000 a month of what the cost is. So what happens is, typically a family's assets cannot survive that. So they go through a period of what's called a spend down. And the first defense, so to speak, is the personal assets of the family. And as you get, that's very scary. And to me, that's very scary when you're spending that much money every month. Now, the key thing, what we like to emphasize to families, is to understand what are the government programs out there. And it depends on really 2 things. One is what level of care a person needs. And then that determines what program they can apply for. And just briefly, if somebody's at home, there is actually a government program called the PDA waiver program. They can pay not only for medical, but also custodial costs. And that's in Pennsylvania. We're talking strictly in Pennsylvania now, because medical assistance, government programs go state by state. Okay. There are income limits associated with that, though, that can prevent somebody qualifying for that. Typically, when somebody's in assisted living, they're not looking for assistance at that point in terms of paying for that care. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen often. With assisted living, the only significant program that we're aware of is the Veterans Aid and Attendance Program. It's for wartime veterans or the surviving spouses of wartime veterans, just briefly. And then finally, if somebody needs a skilled nursing level of care, that's when we're really looking at medical assistance or Medicaid to pay for that. Because that program is dedicated towards, medical assistance is a very wide-ranging program, but the area that talks about long-term care is very dedicated towards that, and they address those issues that way. Also, what's important to know with medical assistance is they make provisions to protect the spouse at home. They understand, yes, there's a significant cost to pay for the cost of care if somebody's in the nursing home, but also we do not want the spouse at home to be impoverished. We want them a guaranteed certain level of assets and a certain level of income, and still have the person qualify for benefits to pay for the cost of care. Now, just briefly, what are pitfalls that people come up against, what families come up against? Gifting is a very important issue, and that's something Janet touched on. What the government calls uncompensated transfer of assets. Gifting. And how they view that is very wide-ranging. Donating to a charitable organization, they consider that a gift. Helping a family member who's not a dependent, if you're paying for a medical operation for them, that's a gift. Giving a family member, for example, a car because they took care of a person for X number of years and wanted to, help pay back. If there's no family agreement, that could be considered a gift. And there are actually penalties associated with that, where the government will delay paying for the cost of care before the person qualifies for government benefits. So one thing to keep in mind is the government has a 5-year period. It would be great if everybody could just think 5 years ahead of time. That's what the government expects families to do. What you do today is going to affect if you're applying for benefits 5 years from now. And the other thing that's important for families to know is there are particular rules. For example, in Pennsylvania, if a spouse has long-term care and the spouse at home stays at home, the spouse at home, their retirement plan is exempt. They don't have to spend that down. If you're in New Jersey, you have to spend that down. So if the spouse at home has that, going back to that retirement, $50,000 in their own retirement, if they're in New Jersey, they have to spend that down for the cost of care before the government benefits would pay. In Pennsylvania, that's exempt. Of course, you have to know it's exempt in order to protect it. Because we've actually had families that said if they didn't come to us, they would have started cashing in their IRA assets or 401k assets that way.
Jeff, do you know if, and is that also the 5-year rule, that if you became aware of it now and said, oh, well, I'm moving to Pennsylvania then, do you have to be in the state of Pennsylvania to keep that exemption?
No, actually, if the person's care is in Pennsylvania, then, they need, the long-term care has to be in Pennsylvania, but the person doesn't have to have resided in Pennsylvania for those 5 years.
Oh, okay.
That's why we don't send people to New Jersey for care. It's important to know these things. You go across the bridge and you can lose benefits.
This next part, this next part here about not being organized, that can unfortunately have very costly consequences. Where a power of attorney, if it's not done properly, if people are missing documents, if they don't know what all the assets are, things like that, and that can come back. We've actually had families that found out later they actually had $60,000 they weren't aware of. That needed to then be spent down. The person got off of government benefits. The money had to be re-spent and a new application submitted, in order to do that. And then finally, we have a very independent-minded, almost rugged, heritage in a way in this country about doing things yourself. But a decision needs to be made when you're going to stop doing everything yourself, and then when you're going to get help. And that's a decision families need to make, and to know when is the appropriate time to kind of look for additional issues. Solutions, the estate documents Janet talked about, will, living will, power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney. Those are the cornerstone of a good, solid legal foundation on which to help somebody with long-term care. Family agreement, Janet mentioned it, that is a relatively new area, but it's a very valuable and important area. Also, it not only helps legally, it helps the family to organize things. So everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and what's gotten in exchange. Also prevents these gifting issues we talked about before. If you are providing a service and getting paid for that, that is not a gift. That is not what the government calls an uncompensated transfer of assets. That's being compensated for something you do. So you don't get a penalty when a family agreement is in place. A written family agreement, right, ahead of time.
I had a question about the documents. If the documents were drawn up, say in Delaware, and we're living in Pennsylvania, is that a problem?
The Delaware document is still good in Pennsylvania. We do recommend that you have it reviewed in Pennsylvania for compliance with Pennsylvania, but it is still valid.
Thank you.
The next part about organizing a team, elder law attorney, tax accountant, financial planner, social worker. You know, think in terms of who are the people who can help you, not only now but in the future. If you're thinking ahead, well, gee, how are things going from where they are now, and just kind of planning ahead, things have less of a likelihood of taking you by surprise, and you avoid those kind of emergency situations that way. And the 5-year, that's the government, the 5-year time frame, that's how far they look back. So it would be great if that's how far you think ahead, in terms of decisions that you make, especially financial decisions, but also care decisions as well. It's really not a bad idea that way. And then this is the key thing. I went to a certified senior advisor with continuing education part, and they have a lot of good speakers. And this one speaker said something that I was trying to say for years, but didn't know exactly how to say. And this was it. It's when long-term care begins, retirement ends. One of the key things a lot of families or members of families don't realize is that long-term care is not part of retirement. They're very different issues that people have. When you're retired, the assets tend to be stable, health issues tend to be stable, you have a certain lifestyle associated and quality of life. When a long-term care situation starts to come into play, when people need more and more help and more skilled care, those are very different situations than somebody being retired. And just realizing that you're going into a new situation, I think automatically means you're ahead of a lot of other people who don't realize that transition happens. And if you just remember that one point and know you're going into a new situation, and the people who haven't been in that situation don't necessarily understand what you're going through, I think you're going to really have a head up in terms of being able to deal with the situation that you have. That's it.
In the interest of full disclosure, I want to let you all know that Dan and I hired Janet and Jeff when we were dealing with his mother. And Jeff is right. Those of you who know me well know that I'm fairly independent. I can do it all kind of person. But you balance that I can do it all, I don't need any help with the stress of not having all the information because you're only human, and not having more than 24 hours in a day, and not having energy that never quits, with giving up some of that independence and having experts on your side. And I can't tell you the amount of relief that it was to us to have an expert. And just this week I faxed Jeff a piece of paper and I said, can I ignore this? Yeah, you can ignore that. Good, I don't have to, you know. So the organizing a team, you know, not just being responsible for yourself, was incredibly stress relieving. And we all have enough stress. So.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Whenever clients are happy, we're really happy.
You know, it's just difficult enough. When you get a call from your parents that are retired and they get that book and they have to now pick their benefits.
They get the book.
Medicare.
Oh, yeah. Just to sit down and figure out, I mean, I had to hire an attorney to help me. Just to figure out what plan was the best plan, because I legally didn't understand the wording to it, because there's so many catchphrases in there. I wanted to make sure, you know, when you look at the slew of prescriptions they're taking, what's covered, what's not, what deductible, what, you know, everything. It's a nightmare. It's an absolute
Well,
nightmare.
and actually, before I left today, I received a phone call. I need to return when I go back to the office, but a lady reported that she changed her prescription drug coverage to a PDP, prescription drug plan, and learned that she lost her health insurance coverage, which can happen. I wrote a column about that some years back, where if you join a prescription drug plan that is independent from, she had previously had Medicare Advantage, she thought she still had Medicare Advantage. Well, it defaulted out and she ended up receiving a notice that now she didn't have health insurance coverage. So it is extremely complicated, and I've spent a lot of time with clients working through those things, and in some cases I get the insurance agent. We have more insurance agents now who deal with Medicare plans, so I get them involved too. But you're right, it's complicated.